I endured years of humiliation in the back by trying to evict me from the house I paid for and force a $50,000 post-nup so his assistant could move in. They laughed at my patched coats, scoffed when I took the bus in December, and counted my tiny inheritance like it was charity. They didn't know I had been running a quiet war at midnight, balancing ledgers while they drank their wine. I had the deeds, the shares, and the receipts ready. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and I am 33 years old. Before I reveal exactly how I dismantled their lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get what they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to the day I decided to stop begging for respect and start collecting proof. When Richard and I married, nobody thought I was special. He was charismatic, tall, with a laugh that filled the room, and his mother, Evelyn, had a way of drawing people into her orbit so easily you forgot to question her. Chloe, his younger sister, wore designer everything and had practiced contempt for me like it was a language she spoke fluently. They assumed I would be grateful for the crumbs of their attention. I met Richard at a networking breakfast in 2014 when I was 27, late for an interview and early for anything else. He was charming about my lateness. We dated fast, he proposed at 6 months, and within a year, we lived in a house that smelled of lemon polish and a life I had to learn how to inhabit. I told myself it was love. I told myself I could be whatever they wanted if I could just keep the peace. The truth was more complicated. Before I ever took that wedding vow, I had arranged my life like a court case. I was an elite forensic accountant, years of numbers, audits, and quiet, meticulous work taught me to see the patterns greedy people left behind. After my father passed, I inherited a portfolio and, more importantly, a private commitment. He had always insisted I never use the family name to buy affection, so I hid the assets. I registered trusts under anonymous companies, put deed titles in nominee names, and taught myself how to vanish behind other people's assumptions. I wasn't showing off. I was protecting what would one day be proof. To Richard and his family, I was Nora, a nickname he used like a leash. I wore thrift store coats stitched to last, took 2 buses when a car was available because I liked the privacy of being unseen, and I did the housework because Evelyn made a point of watching me do it with that look that said, "This is what you were put here for." I scrubbed the stove till the metal shone and smiled while Chloe rolled her eyes at my lack of taste. They invited their friends over and told stories of their financial genius. I sat at the edge of the sofa and nodded. They assumed I was naive, that I believed their fantasies about wealth. When Richard failed to pay a few vendors for his side investments, when Evelyn started pawning family heirlooms with a charming lie, they never imagined I could trace transactions like footprints in snow. I learned to read their tone, arrogance when they felt untouchable, whispers when fear crept in, and cruelty when they needed a scapegoat. My secret came in little windows of time: 2 a.m., a mug of cold coffee, my laptop on the kitchen table while the rest of the house slept. I wasn't only checking bank statements, I was setting up a web of paper and digital evidence that matched my father's advice. If they tried to take what wasn't theirs, prove it. Quietly, I became a majority shareholder in their little empire without their knowledge. I funneled funds through shell entities I controlled, positioned nominee directors, and placed irrevocable trusts that could not be breached by a signed demand from a drunken husband or a scheming mother-in-law. I let them belittle me. It was easier to watch their true colors peel back. They made jokes about my lowly job. Evelyn called me a charity case. Chloe spread the rumor at parties that I was using Richard. At dinner parties, they would pat my hand like a consolation prize and laugh when I insisted on making the salads. The quieter I was, the more they misread me, and they never, ever checked the small type that spelled their end. Everything changed the night Richard's company quietly went public. He had dragged us into his own dream of building something that would finally make Evelyn proud and, more importantly, get the creditors off their backs. He threw a party at the club downtown, glasses of champagne and speeches about family sacrifice. I clapped and felt like an actress in a show written by someone else. The stock did well on the first day, and for once Richard's smile wasn't borrowed. He believed that money would mean safety. Greed, though, has noise. When they believed the market success would cover cracks, Evelyn and Chloe started to plan the finishes they'd had in mind for their lives for years. New cars, more trips, and a way to make sure the right women occupied their favored seats. Within a month of the IPO, the conversations shifted. Richard's assistant, Amber, a 22-year-old with a resume thin as rice paper and a newly glossy Instagram, began to appear at family dinners. Amber laughed at the jokes Evelyn made about me and mirrored them to Richardson's phone camera. She had been coached. The scheme itself was almost elegant in its cruelty. Evelyn proposed a post-nuptial agreement, dressed as stability but written by lawyers who took the sliver of security I had been allowed and aimed to erase it. The postnup would require me to sign away any claims to the home and any future inheritance in exchange for a small, immediate settlement. Richard was eager. He liked the idea of cleaning up complications. Chloe suggested they reclaim the house to host the mistress and the new social life they felt entitled to. They convened a meeting and assumed compliance. They were wrong. Behind closed doors in the upstairs study where I pretended to sew while they whispered, I listened. I heard Richard say, "She'll sign anything. She loves me." Evelyn chuckled, a sound like coins. "We give her a token. She'll thank us for taking care of her." Chloe smeared a lipstick and smirked. Imagine her face when she realizes she has nothing left. It wasn't only the post-nup. They had other plans. They were grooming Amber and making small purchases in the company's name with the intention of billing them as consulting and marketing, siphoning away cash. They planned to lend the company the money they needed for their new lifestyle and then call those loans formal, secured against the assets I believed might exist as safety. They thought the market would keep the cash coming and their little thefts would be concealed under the noise of growth. They had forgotten that every transaction leaves a fingerprint. I felt a cold clarity the night they finalized the vocabulary of betrayal, eviction, sign here, we take care of you. Their confidence was a tidal wave. They left the kitchen with the post-nup printed, the clause about no future claims bolded. Richard kissed Amber in the hall as if victory had a smell. What they didn't know was that the bank transfers, the phantom invoices, the nominee directors, all of it were being recorded. I had software running that cross-referenced every deposit and withdrawal connected to the company, every invoice that had been pushed through a shell corporation, every payment to Amber's account. I began building the case. I didn't react with rage that night. Rage would look like me. Instead, I took meticulous notes and photographed signatures. I sent emails that I later arranged to appear as if from legal counsel, seeding the idea that someone else had already started looking. I set in motion an audit that could not be closed until every irregularity was explained. And then, quietly, I set the calendar for Thanksgiving. Why Thanksgiving? Because that's when the family gathered, when Evelyn liked to preside and Richard liked to be seen as a success. They needed a public stage to assert dominance. They were never more blind than when they thought the performance belonged to them. I discovered their plan not by guessing, but by reconstructing their transactions with the night sight only an auditor knows. Amber's consulting invoices were issued from a company with an address that traced back to a mailbox store 2 blocks from Evelyn's accountant. Chloe had been reimbursed for travel expenses that matched Evelyn's chateau weekend reservations. I matched times, phone records, and the subtle pattern of rushed deposits. Once the pattern became clear, my work turned from observation to construction. Revenge is not a mood, it's a plan. I don't enjoy fantasies of humiliation. I enjoy clean endings. First, I secured the legal foundations. The irrevocable trust my father had insisted on was real, but I needed it to be unassailable. I moved the majority of my voting shares into that trust, appointed a trustee who was a firm I had quietly funded years before, an independent trustee whose job would be to protect assets and enforce the corporate governance of the company. I transferred the deed of the house into a separate title company I controlled through a numbered entity, one that, legally, could not be reached through a signature on a flimsy post-nup. That deed would surprise them at the right moment. Second, I initiated forensic audits. I hired auditors whose faces no one in my family would recognize and gave them a narrow mandate: trace any payments to parties connected to family members and Amber, identify any invoices lacking substantiation, and verify that company loans matched corporate minutes. I did this under the pretense of protecting investor value, the very phrasing that would later justify the investigation to the board and ensure the findings couldn't be dismissed as domestic squabbles. Third, I created a paper trail that would be indisputable in public. I recorded conversations where plans were discussed. Using a recorder I kept in my apron pocket, I learned that trick from courtroom documentaries. I saved text messages where Richard bragged about writing her out. I collected bank statements and matched them to corporate ledgers. Each piece I secured with a timestamp, backed up to 3 different encrypted drives. Fourth, I prepared the legal artillery. My father had left me a lawyer, not in name but in practice, years of legal tuition and a network of professionals who owed him favors. I made discreet calls. I arranged for a provisional restraining order to be filed in the event of impromptu attempts to change company boards or move assets. I prepared an eviction notice template for myself, written not as an act of retaliation but as a legal fact. If the deed was in my nominee company, any attempt to change the title would trigger an immediate remedy. Last, I set the human piece. I reached out to a handful of family friends and investors who had silently supported us. I told a scaled truth, something concerning in the company's books, and in exchange for discretion, I would reveal the details at Thanksgiving. They agreed to be present. Public witnesses were everything. These were people whose reputations mattered to Evelyn and Chloe. They were the glare that would make liars' lips quiver. I never told Richard any of this. He was arrogant enough to think I was too small to matter. When he announced that evening plans would include moving Amber into our guest room permanently, I smiled and said, "Make sure the sheets are fresh." It was a move that, in his mind, extended his conquest into my tolerable domain. In mine, it was an invitation to occupy the stage. I spent the week before Thanksgiving tightening knots. The auditors completed their first pass and found the obvious misdirection: consulting fees with no deliverables, loans recorded as related party with insufficient board minutes, and reimbursements that matched personal travel. The investigator's memo was a surgical note: recommend immediate board review and forensic inquiry. I scheduled the board meeting for the following morning on my calendar as a routine shareholder update. I double-checked the trust documents, confirmed the trustees' presence, and printed a clean set of copies of the incriminating emails and invoices. Most importantly, I made peace with the fact that I would not raise my voice. I had practiced this in the mirror, a calm, controlled tone that would let the evidence do the shouting. When you let facts speak, hysteria becomes yours to avoid. Thanksgiving arrived like a slow inhalation. The house smelled of roasting turkey, of citrus and thyme, and the kind of domestic perfection Evelyn curated to shame other people's holidays. The table was long, candles set just so, and family photos in polished frames took up the mantel like a gallery of entitlement. Guests arrived: investors, neighbors, friends, 3 of whom I trusted to be impartial, and 2 of whom had the moral weight to scold without mercy. I wore a simple dress, neither thrift nor flamboyant, a neutral that read steady. Richard sashayed in with Amber on his arm, her laugh practiced and loud. Chloe glided like she belonged on a magazine cover, and Evelyn presided with the smugness of a woman who believed she had cornered fate. We ate until the main course was decimated, and the wine had been refilled. Conversation turned to the company's performance. Richard basked in the glow of applause. That was my cue. I stood quietly, set my water glass down, and said, "Before dessert, there are a few matters I think we need to address." The room blinked. I could feel the shift, like the moment a stage light finds a minor actor unexpectedly competent. I had rehearsed how to lower my voice so the microphones of attention would lean in. "I asked for a routine shareholder update," I said. "There have been irregularities in last quarter's bookkeeping that cannot be ignored. I commissioned an independent forensic audit. The initial report shows related party payments, undocumented consulting fees, and unauthorized loans that were never approved by the board." I handed a single copy of the 27-page executive summary to the investor across from me, the one whose opinion mattered most to Evelyn, and he read the first line. Silence at that table is its own punctuation. Richard laughed, high and brittle. "Nora, what are you talking about? We had the board's blessing. Gloria signed off." "Gloria is not on the minutes," I interrupted. "And there are no minutes for the loans listed as family support." I slid another copy of the audit toward the trustee, who was now awake like a sleeping animal on command. The expressions began to fracture. Evelyn's smile faltered. Chloe's cigarette of confidence began to skid. Then I did what the auditors had taught me was the critical move: evidence. I read aloud the invoice numbers, the dates, and the sums. I described the shell corporation, its mailbox address, and the bank that had accepted the wire to Amber's account. I quoted text messages where Richard bragged about covering the family tab and where Evelyn told Chloe to take advantage, life's short. I didn't need to scream. The numbers did the horror. "You don't understand," Evelyn said, voice small. "Those were gifts." "They are corporate expenditures," I replied, turning a page. "They were recorded as marketing expenses and billed to shareholders. That is fraud if unsubstantiated. The trustee has already moved to place the company under a temporary freeze to allow a full legal review." The trustee, a blonde woman in a navy suit, nodded curtly. 2 phone calls later, I had filed a request for an emergency meeting of the board. 3 emails later, the broker holding the shares froze transfers. The room moved like a net closing. Richard stood, a man realizing his script had been yanked. "You'll ruin us!" he shouted. "You promised to be discreet." "I promised to protect investor value," I said, soft as a verdict. "I promised not to let their greed bankrupt what is ours to steward." Chloe's face was white. She demanded to see the documents. The copies were already in the hands of the investors, and the investors' eyes read like verdicts drawn in graphite. Amber tried to cry, but what she needed was substantiation, and documents do not supply drama. She looked at Evelyn like a child betrayed by a storybook villain. Then the final move, the deed. "I should also say," I continued, when the temperature at the table had become surgical, "that someone has been very eager to change the terms of the household. They presented a post-nuptial agreement earlier this month." Evelyn snapped. "We did that to secure the family's future." "You attempted to have me sign away my home and any future claims," I replied, and then I slid a set of papers across the table. "The house is titled to an entity I control. The trustee has confirmed the title is protected. Any attempt to evict or retitle will be met with a formal notice and enforcement." I watched their faces as the words landed. It was one thing to count money on a ledger. It was another to find the legal horizon closing in. Richard lunged forward, grabbed the papers with a dryness that called attention to the trembling in his hands. "You can't," he said, a child suddenly realizing adults are fallible. "You already tried," I said. "You tried to steal the heirloom Gloria, which Evelyn sold last month to pay a bill. The buyers sent me an invoice with Evelyn's handwriting. That is sufficient evidence of a pattern. The audit names particular transactions and people. The board will decide. In the meantime, the company is under review, and law enforcement has been alerted about irregular payments. I have already provided preliminary documentation. The room heard law enforcement like thunder. Evelyn clutched her pearls, which were undoubtedly on a loan, and cried, "You would call the police?" Her face cracked into something raw, as if the shield of entitlement had been stolen. The guests who had come because I asked quietly exchanged glances. The investor pushed his chair back. The neighbor who had been a source of whispered admiration for Evelyn looked away, ashamed. Evelyn tried a practiced speech about misunderstanding and sacrifice and the sanctity of family, but the words had been spent on 1,000 dinners before. They had no purchase now. Amber stood and bolted. Chloe dropped her napkin and left at the first recess, lipstick a smear of panic. Richard tried to grab my arm, but the trustee put a hand up, and that simple gesture stopped him like a red light. "No," the trustee said. "You will not. The board is convening tomorrow." When the sheriff's deputy arrived, because I had requested a formal enforcement of the deed in advance, a legal precaution, it felt almost ceremonious. He served a notice confirming the freeze on corporate accounts and an order to preserve all records. The deputy's presence made it very clear this was no longer a family feud. It was a legal matter with witnesses and documentation. Evelyn fell apart in the foyer, not dramatic tears, but the ugly collapse of a woman whose map had always shown her at the center. She begged, croaked promises, whispered that she had only wanted comfort. Richard pleaded, half apology, half blame. They were small then, not monsters, but human beings who had built themselves on false ground and were now discovering how wet and sinking that ground could be. "Please," Evelyn begged me at one point, the voice of a woman who was discovering that doors close as surely as they open. "Eleanor, don't do this. For the family." I looked at her and felt nothing that resembled pity. I felt a vast, cool satisfaction. "You had every opportunity to do the right thing," I said. "Instead, you stole and you lied. I am not interested in drama. I am interested in justice." I turned to the room, to the guests, to the investors. "If you came here tonight because you believed in our story, then you now have the facts. I asked for honesty. That is all." Then I sat down. The plates clinked as the turkey knives cut silence into smaller pieces. No one spoke. The rest of the night was a series of phone calls and statements, and somewhere between the dessert and the leftovers, I felt the last of their confidence fall away like a curtain. They begged. They promised change. They sent me flowers, not for my home, but for their reputations. Evelyn mailed letters to mutual friends in a frantic attempt to spin the narrative into family heartbreak. Chloe posted a vague Instagram about unfair attacks and women supporting women, using every phrasing a publicist would later try to unpack. Richard offered the apology of a man who thinks words can be currency for actions. Amber vanished from social media and moved back to a town with fewer windows. But the law is a slow and honest machine. The audits continued. The forensic investigators assembled their report and handed it to the board, which had convened and acted on my request. They found systematic misappropriation of corporate funds, insufficient corporate minutes authorizing the so-called loans, and related party transactions that had been hidden. The board removed Richard from any managerial position pending a full investigation and demanded restitution of unauthorized payments. Evelyn faced civil suits for selling items under false pretenses. The buyers of the heirloom received full disclosure and returned what they could. Where items were gone, Evelyn faced claims. Chloe had to answer to expense audits and, where funds had been misapplied, to repayment plans that wiped her bank cushion. Amber was investigated. The nominee companies used as conduits were frozen. In 1 week, the lives that had felt invulnerable were rearranged into bankruptcy filings and legal consultations. They begged at my door with all the theatrical regret of people who had never known the cost of modest living. I listened to each plea like an archivist cataloging the decline of a once sturdy arrogance. They would ask where it had gone wrong, and I would tell them bluntly, "They mistook my silence for weakness. They confused appearances for truth. They believed the world owed them because they smiled for its cameras." I had no wish to savor every moment. Killing a lie is not as fun up close as you imagine, but I allowed myself a few private moments of relief. I walked into the study one evening after the board meeting and opened the windows. Cold air with the smell of rain came in. I sat in the chair Richard had preferred and thought of my father, and I felt the truth of what I'd done settle like well-made concrete. Legal remedies are not the only things that completed the arc. I reclaimed my mornings. The house once associated with humiliation was now peaceful in a new way, quiet, deliberate, and free of the performative cruelty that had shadowed it. I opened a small fund to help employees who had been used as fronts in the schemes. They had been frightened and misled. They deserved better. I invited the friends who had stood with me to tea and told them nothing dramatic, only laughter and recipes and a sense of ordinary joy. Richard moved out. He found a smaller apartment and an accountant who would take on his complicated financial life if he paid enough and accepted a minimal public profile. Evelyn moved near a church and a therapist. She took to morning walks and, in odd moments, would send a note that read like a person trying to relearn integrity. Chloe survived by working extra shifts to pay back what she had misdirected and learned, painfully, how to ask forgiveness and offer restitution. Amber, well, youth has an appetite for reinvention. One day she turned up in a small town doing honest work and, by all reports, learned how to be unseen and then how to be steady. Me? I opened the study to my life in a way I had denied myself before. I donated anonymously to a women's shelter in town and set up an educational fund for girls whose fathers told them to be invisible. I kept the trust intact and used the dividends to fund community causes, nothing flashy. I learned that power can be quiet and that discretion, when wielded with intention, protects more than possessiveness ever could. A few months later, at a neighborhood bake sale, a woman approached me and said, "I watched you at Thanksgiving. I thought you'd cry." I smiled. "I don't cry when truth is doing the work," I said. "I just make sure it finishes the job." There is a clearing after a storm when you can finally see the path ahead. Mine looked like small things: a morning coffee on the front porch, a neighbor's cat who trusted me, the satisfaction of legal papers filed the right way. The ruin of their performative wealth was not my joy. It was the consequence of choices they had made. I had only made sure their choices had to face daylight. If you're watching this and you have a story where others have tried to steamroll your dignity, know this: silence is not always cowardice. It can be planning. And there is a particular justice in using the language they understand, contracts, ledgers, letters, to show them that truth is not a rumor. It's evidence. I am Eleanor Hayes. I once wore a patched coat to be invisible. Now, the coat lives in the closet, and the house is mine, by right and by record. I am no longer interested in being seen for the sake of their pride. I am interested in being known for my peace. If anything in this story comforts you or teaches you a small tactic, keep your records, hire an honest auditor, trust the quiet power of evidence, then it was worth telling.